It's an honor to be interviewing Dean Edward Wing at his house at 25 Cook Street in Providence, Rhode Island. Dean Wing was the Dean for the Division of Biology, Public Health, and Medicine. We would like to have this interview entered into the archive for Brown University for students, researchers of the present and future. So, Dean Wing, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to interview you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, just to let people know about your life story and how it led to being here at Brown and becoming the dean.
Sure. So I'm delighted to be able to talk about the deanship here of, and let me just correct you just a little bit, it's the Dean of Medicine and Biological Sciences. And when I was the dean, it included public health. So that's the official title. So I became interested in medicine probably in high school. I liked biology. I went to Williams College, where I was pre-med, but I hadn't really decided until I started working in a hospital one summer. I was an orderly. So it's very interesting being an orderly. You empty bedpans, you do all of this sort of nitty-gritty of hospital work. I reported to nurses. And so I always remind nurses, I used to report to you, But I became absolutely enthralled with medicine at that point. I just liked it. I liked being in the hospital. I liked helping to make people better. I liked the activity. I just liked every part of it. And just as an anecdote, I was in the hospital and I was watching the chief of medicine, interestingly, with some residents in the hospital. And they'd just come out of a room examining a patient. So they'd just seen a patient, just examined the patient. They came out and the chief of medicine asked the resident, "Did you hear the rows in the patient's chest?" They were listening to the patient's chest with the stethoscope. And the resident said, "No, not really." And the chief said, "You didn't hear them? Let's go back in again and listen." And they all marched back in to do it again. That so impressed me that my goal from then on was to be a chief of medicine. And I did, actually, years and years later. But that whole experience in the hospital really settled me on medicine. At Williams College, I worked very hard. I played sports. I was a football player, lacrosse player, but at that school, I was able to be pre-med as well. I went to the Harvard Medical School afterwards. Right after college, I married my wife, Rena Rimsky Wing, as it turned out. We had gone together in high school. We dated in high school and partly through college, married right after college. And then she entered a Harvard program as well in social psychology. So we were both graduate students at Harvard. And Harvard Medical School was terrific. It was the smartest group of people I've ever been around. You take a whole bunch of people who did very well in undergraduate school, throw them together in medical school, and the competition was pretty fierce, as you can imagine. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the clinical parts particularly. I enjoyed microbiology. I did research for a summer at Harvard in a very famous lab, and I swore that I'd never do research again, and particularly the type of research I was doing on macrophages. It just was not, I just couldn't stand it. And so I did a residency at the Peter Brent Brigham Hospital at the time. It's now the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Enjoyed that. It was very intensive, though. It was every other night call for part of the year as an intern. So we were on 36 hours. I worked literally 36 hours, sometimes without any sleep. Come home, see my wife and new child for 12 hours, but I didn't really see them because I was so tired. I'd sleep for most of the time, get up in the morning, and then start another 36 hours. So it was a very, very rough internship. In retrospect, when I think about it, we got very good at acute medicine, but we didn't learn as much as we could have. So people who think back on those years, there's some advantages, but most of it is disadvantages. So I came away with that conclusion. I spent 2 years at the Brigham. Rena had finished her PhD at that point, was doing a postdoc. We then moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for 2 years. I was in the National Health Service Corps, and it was a welcome break. I took care of patients in primary care in a city called Hazelwood, which is an old steel mill outside of Pittsburgh. And it was great. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the sort of time off from academics, and decided there that I didn't have to go back to Harvard. I had a residency waiting for me, but I realized there was very good medicine outside of Route 128, outside of Boston. So I looked around the country for fellowships and went out to Stanford for 2 years to work with Jack Remington in infectious diseases. And that was really a life-changing event. We enjoyed California. Rena actually started her career then in weight control. She's a world's expert in obesity, but that's where her interest started. But I went into the laboratory with Jack Remington, and he was working on toxoplasmosis and macrophages. So all of a sudden I was doing research with macrophages again, and I loved it. I just thought it was the cat's meow. I just spent hours and hours in the lab, got a lot done, and that sort of set my course. That I was going to do research in immunology and then pursue an academic career. I thought briefly about going into practice in California because California is so wonderful. And Jack Remington said, "You better not. You owe me," he said, "to go into academics and try it." He was that kind of person. So I did, and I went back to Pittsburgh to join the faculty. They offered me a very good deal. I was at a hospital called Montefiore Hospital, and that's where I spent the next 20 years in academics. I did research. I rounded in medicine for 3 months in the year, rounded in infectious diseases for 4 months in the year. Had a successful career in terms of research. I had NIH funding for most of that time, and then did something which I never thought I would do. And that is, my father-in-law, who's a businessman from New York, said, "Why don't you go into administration?" And I said, "I'd never do that. That's the worst thing. You know, that's like going over to the dark side." But I did. So I sort of picked out of the pack. I became physician-in-chief at Montefiore Hospital in 1990 during a merger. And it was a very tough time. I had to work with faculty and residents and students to effect a merger with Presbyterian Hospital. Did well at that. I enjoyed it, even though it was very stressful. I then did more administrative jobs at Pittsburgh. So I became a vice chairman of the Department of Medicine. I became, for 5 years, I was head of infectious diseases. I then became the interim chair of medicine at Pittsburgh, which I enjoyed. I really got a kick out of it for about 2.5 years. And then looked for jobs and got the job as chair of medicine at Brown. And so that was a big deal. So I was in my early 50s. Rena had to pick up her research and sell her house. She didn't like that, but made the move to Providence. And I thought Providence was wonderful. I think I enjoyed the history of Providence, but I particularly enjoyed the sailing in Rhode Island. So I'm a sailor. I grew up with it. In Pittsburgh, what do? You sail in the Monongahela River? I don't think so. You know, you had to go a ways away. And so in, in Providence, the first thing I bought was a boat, not a house. We were living in an apartment, bought the boat, then we bought a house. And so that was sort of my priorities. And I've had wonderful experiences sailing in Narragansett Bay and out to the islands, to Block Island and Martha's Vineyard and to Nantucket over the years. It's been great. So it's been a wonderful part of the move. But I came here to be the first chair of medicine who really had line authority over the major parts of the Department of Medicine, which were at the Miriam Hospital and a Presbyterian Hospital. I was executive chairman at Memorial Hospital and at Women and Infants Hospital, but those were not as important as the 2 other hospitals, the Miriam and Presbyterian. The Miriam Presbyterian had a long history of having their own chairs of medicine, their own faculty, their own practice plans, and their own training programs. So I was the first person brought in to try to merge those together. And Brown had a long history of trying to get a chair of medicine. They couldn't do it. People would come in and they'd say, "Once you fix that structural problem of having disparate departments of medicine, give me a call." So I didn't do that. I came in to do it because I'd already done something like it in Pittsburgh, and I regarded that as a challenge. And it was a challenge. So over the next 3 or 4 years, my major tasks as chair of medicine were bringing the Department of Medicine together. So I merged fellowships, I merged practice plans. A political necessity was creating 2 practice plans, one in medicine and one in cardiology. And we did that. I was also able to hire a number of division chiefs, either from the outside or from the inside. So it was an opportunity to pick new leadership in the Department of Medicine and also to have new finances. I imposed a 10% tax on the clinical income of the department and was able to use those resources to recruit people or to build programs. For example, in infectious diseases, I appointed Tim Flanagan, who is an internal candidate, and he was a phenomenon. He's a rainmaker in terms of research, in terms of hiring new people. And the research in that group went from, I can't remember, 3 million to 10 million during my time as chair, a huge, huge jump. Overall, the research in the department quadrupled during my time as chair, and that was a primary aim of mine. I actually articulated that all the time and threw up the graphs of how we were doing in research. So it's very important as a leader to pick out certain priorities. So research was my #1 priority. I said we have to grow it. We're an Ivy League Department of Medicine, and it's critical that we make that a priority. And we'd also reorganize, which is probably the most important thing. Now, during that time, there were a lot of challenges. Cardiologists were basically in private practice mode. They were not particularly academic. The research actually was not very strong at all. But they had a very strong clinical base, and they were good teachers. But it wasn't a particularly academic group. And so I jostled with them and sort of sparred with them over the years to try to improve that, to bring in an academic leader. We had trouble doing that. And so even though cardiology was strong clinically, it never really grew in terms of its research potential. In general, cardiology should be 50% of the research and the clinical income of a department, and ours was not in terms of research. So it was always a little bit of an issue in terms of cardiology. And there were other challenges. I had challenges with the hospital, and when I say the hospital, particularly Presbyterian Hospital.
Rhode Island Hospital?
I'm sorry, Rhode Island Hospital, I'm mixing up my cities. The Rhode Island Hospital has been a very successful long-term hospital with a strong academic bent, but its priorities have always been financial. And so we jostled, and it's not unusual, in terms of what the main priorities should be. And I was always pushing the academic, and they were always concerned about their financial viability. So it was a natural tension, but it was something that I had to deal with. The other tension that I had as chairman, not unusual, was with Brown and with the dean. So Don Marsh had hired me. I always got along with Don very well. He didn't get along with the hospital so well, and so he continuously, struggled to deal with the number of hospitals who were in the Brown system and to figure out a way to really promote the academic enterprise. And I think he had difficulties with that. And then there was an interim in terms of other deans that I dealt with. So Richard Besdine was an interim dean. So he was in my department. I actually hired him along with public health and geriatrics. But he was sort of went and then came back. And then a new dean, Ellie Adachi, was somebody that I dealt with for a couple of years. There wasn't any tension between us, but it wasn't a strong relationship. And so the deanships, it sort of varied through the years. My goal was to be chairman of medicine. That was it. I didn't want anything else, actually. So that was really what I'd settled on my life's goal. So at the end of 10 years or 11 years as chair, I was going to re-sign up, but I wasn't particularly enthusiastic. I'd done it, and I'm a believer that leadership sort of ends at certain points, and 10 years is probably a maximum, and I'd accomplished much of what I'd wanted to do. But you also start developing some barnacles at the end of that time. You're slowed down by commitments you've made, by the fact that you have old ideas, not particularly new ideas, people know you, and you just slow down slowly in terms of what you can get done, I think. So I was not interested in the deanship particularly, but Ruth Simmons wanted to do an internal search for the deanship when Ellie Adachi had stepped down after a couple of years. So she was interviewing internal candidates, and I was included in that group. And then I became interested. I was interested. She interviewed other people. She ran into political problems in my recruitment because she didn't do an open national search. She did an internal search. She was highly criticized by the alumni of the medical school, who had supported Ellie Adachi to some extent, but so concerned about his stepping down, but also They just didn't like the idea of sort of a quick internal search. They wanted to have a national search. It's interesting. So Ruth had to do some backpedaling in terms of meeting with them, satisfying with them, putting somebody from that group onto the search committee and enlarging it a little bit. But I was chosen eventually. And I came in under Ruth Simmons, who was a very, very powerful president of the university. She had been in place for about 5 years, and so I was looking forward to being the new dean of medicine and biological sciences, which would put me over the medical school, all the clinical departments, the 13 or so clinical departments, and all of the 600 plus faculty in the full-time departments, all of the thousands actually in the clinical departments, people in private practice, also in charge of the biological science, 6 departments of biology at Brown for undergraduates, and also the program in public health. The undergraduates, I was all of a sudden responsible for undergraduates. What do I know about a freshman? Not much. So I had to sort of adjust and be interested in their learning over the 4 years as undergraduates. I was in charge of the PLME program, which is our 8-year program, when I was dean. So students would be admitted into Brown undergraduate for 4 years and be guaranteed a spot in there in the medical school. So it was a unique program around the country, very successful. I was in charge of that, but also in charge of public health. And public health had a long history, but really there was a commitment from Brown fairly early on from the very strong lobbying of particularly Fox Weddell and Vince Moore to have a school of public health. And so that was a long-term sort of political process and something that the corporation and Ruth Simmons had committed to before I came into the situation. When I say school of public health, that would split it out from the medical school and from the biological sciences. So that's the story of how I became the dean. Long story.
No, it's a fantastic story. I want to follow up with this 4 small questions on that. One is, if you could say, I know sports had been the important part of Williams, whether that was part of your ethos. If you said what your philosophy of sport, if that transferred into philosophy of administration. There's an apocryphal story of your time as a community health center doctor, that of you riding your bike with a ponytail down the hill, whether that may or may not be true.
With a ponytail?
With a ponytail.
Never did it.
But riding the bike.
Yeah.
And then the time period when you were chair, there had been 8 affiliated hospitals, and there suddenly became 7, if that was part of with the Roger Williams and more on the merging of the Miriam and
I see what you're saying, yeah. So the ponytail, never had a ponytail. Had a mustache, didn't have a ponytail.
And had a bike.
I've always ridden my bike. So I would commute in Pittsburgh, and actually commuted in Pittsburgh throughout my career there, and then I've commuted in Providence as well, particularly as the dean. It was a shorter distance, and so I've always commuted on bike.
Sports?
So sports, I was very good. I played football and lacrosse. I made a second team Little All-American, which is smaller schools when I was in college. I had terrific statistics. I was a tailback. It's great to run behind some really big offensive linemen. That's a secret. So, but I was good, and so I had broke a lot of records at Williams. I also played lacrosse, which I wasn't that good at, but we had a fabulous team and won the New England Championship my sophomore year. I didn't play sports after that, interesting. I played my junior year in football, but after that I stopped. I had some vertigo, probably related to a labyrinthitis, but sort of used that as an excuse not to play because I was interested in medicine. I was going with Rena and just had other things I wanted to do. So at a place like Williams, you could actually do that. It wasn't so hard.
As your sports style, is there ways in which it's influenced your management
Right.
style?
So one of the things I've always had in my office is a picture of me running with a football, about to put my head down and run over somebody. So occasionally during a meeting, I'd glance over at this picture, and people got the message that they sort of thought I was a tough guy who might run over them. Not really true, but it was a little bit my style, which is to be very straightforward and to try to accomplish goals. And I'm a little more subtle than I was on the football field, but it is a characteristic of mine, to really be goal-oriented, to charge ahead and try to make things happen.
That's great.
Right. So that has, and people really thought that of me. Oh, he's a football, he's just like that in the football. And people keep saying that. It's not quite true. You have to be a little more than a football player.
And the time period you were the chair of medicine in terms of the merger of Rhode Island Hospital and the Miriam, and then the chapter with the Roger Williams Hospital.
I'm sorry. So the major hospitals I've dealt with were really what I said. So it's really the Rhode Island Hospital and the Miriam Hospital. And it really was a mirror of what I'd done in Pittsburgh with Montefiore Hospital and Presbyterian. So many of the same issues I was used to. Brown had always had a number of teaching hospitals, and they did it in part because they weren't particularly interested in clinical medicine. They wanted to farm out those responsibilities to these different hospitals. So in fact, there were at times 5, maybe even 6 chairs of medicine that was rotated around between the hospitals, and 6 different, maybe I may be wrong, maybe 5 different training programs in medicine. Very, very awkward. It used to be more of a common model in years past, but not recently. So that Roger Williams Hospital was spun out actually by Don Marsh. Wasn't here at that point. A very controversial move. People at Roger Williams are very upset by it. I think it was probably the right thing. We just had too many teaching hospitals. And then dealing with the current, the current model is also awkward. We have 2 different hospital systems, one of Lifespan and one of Care New England. And Care New England has 3 teaching hospitals and at least 1 non-teaching hospital at this point. So in the Brown system, it's a teaching hospital, but not a Brown one. So the system even now persists in being somewhat awkward. So that is something every dean has had to deal with. Parenthetically, I came in with a different attitude, view about those teaching hospitals than previous deans. And that is, we had one major teaching hospital, the Rhode Island Hospital, and even more so because now the Rhode Island Hospital has merged with the Miriam Hospital. That's our major client, if you will. It's a major teaching hospital. It's where most of the teaching goes on in Brown. It's where the vast majority of faculty are, the vast majority of research. It's where the clinical chairs primarily are, except you and a few others, but most of them are based at that system. So I acknowledged that from the get-go, whereas previous deans had said, well, we have to balance these hospitals off so none of them become particularly powerful. I thought that was not realistic, and I really favored acknowledging the primary hospital in the system.
You've talked actually, it's actually great because you've provided a real background and a very cogent life story. 2 questions that I just wanted to get into. Now, one is, when you look back at what you've accomplished to this point, what are some of your major career accomplishments that you're most proud of, your joys, disappointments, lessons learned, and what lessons learned would you provide for future leaders, for future deans?
Yeah, that's the broadest question I've ever heard. So are you talking about my whole career?
Whichever part you would like to talk about, yes.
Yeah. So I've been blessed really with having the opportunities to do a lot of different things. So I've very much enjoyed my research. I thought that was great, pursued it for many years. It was basic immunology using an animal model, and it was extremely interesting, very satisfying. So that was part of the satisfaction. The other thing is I've always been oriented towards clinical care. I've always really enjoyed it from the first time I was an orderly in a hospital to a student and then a resident in my training and then as a junior faculty. So in fact, I've never given that up. I've always taken care of patients. I started taking care of patients from the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. I remember when the first cases from Los Angeles were reported by Dr. Gottlieb in MMWR, and thinking, oh, that is really something, that is unique. These are 5 young men who had pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, very unusual pneumonia. No obvious explanation. So that was the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and it's something that I have always taken care of AIDS patients. I haven't done research particularly in it, but from the beginning I've taken care of AIDS patients. And actually, I may write a book about my experience because I saw the epidemic from the beginning till the present, and 2 days I'm going to be taking care of my patients again. I take care of them every week. I have a clinic. But I've also seen patients overseas. We've been able to develop programs in Africa and the Dominican Republic and Haiti and other places. So I've seen AIDS there, and it's almost like going back to the beginning of the epidemic, where there aren't drugs in some places and there's not opportunity. So that's a particular interest of mine clinically, but I've always enjoyed medicine and I've always enjoyed infectious diseases. So clinical medicine has been a huge satisfaction. But probably the most satisfaction I've gotten is being administrative, even though it's a pain in the neck, you know. It's very stressful, but you never get thanked, you know. So if you're chair of medicine or division chief, you're having to set priorities, to lead by example, and then to accomplish things. And you really can. And so it's very satisfying when you do that. You never accomplish everything you want to do, but you can make some significant strides for the institution that you're involved in, either a department or a division or a hospital or a medical school. So those have been huge satisfactions. You know, in Pittsburgh, when I was chair of medicine, even though for 2.5 years I put in a whole new compensation package. I rearranged the Department of Medicine. I brought groups in from having individual practice plans into a single practice plan. Hired a bunch of new people. So there's a series of things at each step where you can sort of point to accomplishments. It's not all you, but it's partly you. So that's been satisfying, and I've also just enjoyed people. So it's a people job, you know. You got to be a psychiatrist in the job, so you got to listen primarily, and then really support people, and make some hard decisions. The decisions can be difficult, and I never found the decisions that difficult. I've always, mainly because I've always put the institution at the top. So you got to do what's good for the institution. So even though somebody's whining, sometimes they do, about something they want, if it's not good for the institution, then there's not a strong rationale for it always. So I've enjoyed all those aspects, you know, being able to accomplish something. I've enjoyed running things. I've enjoyed the people, enjoyed setting priorities and leading by example. So those are a huge, huge satisfaction. And I've been able to do that at both the division chief, the chairmanship, and then the dean.
Great.
Dean's a little different than chairmanship.
Do you want to expound on that?
Yeah, so most people probably realize that. So the deanship is a very, very broad job. So I described who I was responsible for. It's really all of the departments in the faculty in biology, all of the departments and faculty and trainees in the clinical departments, that's medicine, surgery, family medicine, obstetrics, etc. And then all of the public health. You're really responsible for that overall. So if there's a problem or an opportunity, you're the guy where the buck stops. And so you have to take those responsibility. And you also have to realize that it's a medical school. Medical school, that's medical students, teaching medical students. That has to be the first priority, and lots of times people forget that, but that is the priority. So the medical students are extremely important. So that's the job internally. Those are the people who report to you. The chairs are the primary people who report to you. And then the external parts of that are the relationships with the hospitals particularly. So I met on a very regular basis with the CEOs of the hospitals, with board members from the hospitals. I would meet with other people from the hospitals themselves. And then on the Brown side, it's a very busy job. You're going to meetings all the time at Brown. Brown invents new meetings all the time. It's like this continuous parade of meetings. And so you interact with the provost, with the dean of the faculty, the dean of students, other administrators, and the president. It's a key part. I actually, as the dean, reported directly to the president, but I interacted a lot with the provost, depending on who the provost was. And so that was a huge job. At Brown, it's a very integrated system, so the corporation has got their fingers in all kinds of things. It's a very involved corporation for the good, but it's a large corporation, there are more than 50 people. So you're dealing with corporation members all the time and the corporation committees, and they meet 3 times a year. It's a very heavy load, I think, compared to most places. So the Brown Corporation, the Brown administration, and then other departments of Brown, it's a huge job. By the way, it was fascinating to me. I'd always been in a medical school, and all of a sudden I'm talking to people who are talking about Kant, or modern French music or whatever. I mean, I'm interested, but knew very little about it. Sometimes I'd say couldn't understand what they said, and I'd say, I don't understand what you just said, and then they bring it down a level. They say, I still don't understand. And then they bring it down to sort of like lay people, and I don't understand what they were saying. And literally, that was a communication issue in terms of faculty was an important problem. But to the point, the major job of the dean is to interpret the medical school, the importance of the medical school and the hospitals to the Brown community. For example, most faculty at Brown on the campus don't understand what clinical faculty do. Clinical faculty teach a huge amount, but it's not something they understand. You'd say, well, they teach at the bedside, they're rounded for a month in infectious diseases. Well, they didn't really teach, they didn't prepare a lecture, they didn't do the usual, they didn't grade papers. So the Brown, you had to educate continuously on the Brown campus. So you had to work with the hospitals, you had to work with the Brown community, and then there's an external community. So I dealt with, say, our legislators, our senators and our representatives, or the mayor of the city, or the community surrounding the medical school. Very important constituents, and particularly in Rhode Island, things are very close, and so it's important to have good relations and to work on those relations as well. So the job is very broad. I brought together a leadership team. I worked hard at that. Kept a few people, named certain people, hired a new chief administrator, Lindsey Graham, and then we had an initial retreat, right when I took over as dean and brought this group together. We all did Myers-Briggs. I was way out there. I was like near nobody, and they were all clustered over here.
Do you remember what you were in the Myers-Briggs?
I could point to it, but it's, they had leadership stuff, but there was some aspect that I was a little unusual at. But that was very useful, actually. And so we brought together a group. It was a good group. We met once a week for a couple hours, and then much more on individual meetings. But that leadership group was critical. So we had people, Fox Weddle from Public Health, Ed Horat from Biology, Glenn Tung was responsible for the relationships with the hospitals. And then Phil Gapuso was responsible for the medical school, for the training of the medical students, and Shelley Sear for other issues with hospital faculty. So it's a series of people, I'm not mentioning them all, who came together as a group, and it was critical to do that. Most of them have stayed on with the new dean, Jack Elias, so he's felt that they've been valuable, and that's a critical aspect of running the deanship because the job is so broad.
Well, you've spoken now a bit about the relationships and the stakeholders. Anything you'd like to say more about this, your role when you were dean, it was students, the faculty, campus departments, even with the hospitals or politicians?
Yeah, so as I said, some of the main stakeholders in the medical school are the chairs of the clinical departments, and they vary widely from the chair of the Department of Medicine, who has hundreds of faculty, scores and scores of trainees, actually well over 130 trainees, that's residents and fellows, responsible for the majority of teaching in the medical school, and then the majority of research really within the medical school, not quite, but almost. So that person is critical. When I stepped down as chair, a good friend of mine, Lance Dworkin, took over as interim, and then we hired a new chair from Cleveland, Cleveland VA, Lou Rice, who's done a very good job, so as a critical recruit. And that recruitment takes place between the dean and the head of the hospital, and in this case, Tim Babineau. So that recruitment of a chair was a critical function of what we did. Hired a number of other chairs. Marty Keller in psychiatry had stepped down during my time as dean, and we hired Steve Rasmussen, who was in the department, but again, a critical recruit. And I did that again with the hospitals. Karen Fury is a new chair of neurology, terrific chair of neurology, and so we recruited her out of Harvard. Those recruits, recruiting leadership are absolutely critical recruits. Brian Zink has been a very successful chair of emergency medicine and hired before I came, but he was offered a terrific job back in Michigan. So we had to scramble to put together a good package, including an endowed chair, to keep him at Brown. So again, I did that with the hospital. So those recruitments and retentions, very important, but then also I had to deal with problems with the chairs. And so there might be a chair who's not running a very good clerkship. And so we had to try to get that person to make the clerkship a priority. And that happened in a number of cases. Don Kustan, who was the chair, did a terrific job of turning his clerkship around. It was a very unpopular one. It had significant problems, and he just did it. He made changes in terms of how students were regarded on the OB service, and that made a huge difference. And then other chairs, they haven't done a very good, they're still not doing a very good job, and we worked on them and worked on them. And it was, so you don't always win in that situation. You know? So that was a critical part of my job, was working with the chairs to accomplish our goals. And I had to push chairs to be more research-oriented. Some just weren't. And you know, it's a slow process. So we did do that, though.
When you think about when you first came to Rhode Island, what were some of your first impressions of Providence, of Rhode Island, of Brown University, of the medical school, which at that point was called Brown Medical School?
Right, right. So I like the fact a lot that Brown is an Ivy League school. So no matter what current status or what's happening, it has this huge advantage of the name and the fact that it's in the Ivy League. So you automatically attract people, attract very good students, good faculty. They want to come, just like me. I wanted to come to an Ivy League medical school. So that was, the Brown name trumps an awful lot of things. Brown was this huge opportunity for me as the chair of medicine. It was like wide open. I could craft this department the way I wanted. And you had a dean at that point, Don Marsh, who was very academically oriented, who really wanted the place to come up in terms of its rankings of medical schools in the country. So it was great. Brown itself is a very liberal institution. I'm not. I'm conservative. Although if you ask me an issue, I tend to be sort of liberal on a lot of issues, you know. But in general, the sort of, and I'm going to put it, extreme liberalism of the campus is not something that I agree with. And so it is biased. I see that all the time. There are very few conservative professors on the campus. The overall attitude is more to the left than I would like. And that's a difference between me and sort of the culture at Brown. But it's okay. I'm one of the conservative professors. But I didn't mention one thing I should mention, which is that as a leader, I came into the deanship with 3 priorities. One was to build a medical school. The second was to improve relations with the hospitals. And the third was to build a practice plan. And that's it. I didn't go any further. Those were the big priorities. And I kept telling people over and over that those were the priorities. So we had a very successful construction project, if you will, to build a new medical school building. And so that was a huge accomplishment. I hope that's not the only reason I'm remembered, but that is sort of the signature of my deanship. And it came in part because of the gift of Warren Alpert of $100 million towards the medical school, and his foundation gave that money. They were terrific in terms of how they delivered. He had passed away, but he made that gift. And that's one of the reasons I took the deanship. I got $100 million. I didn't really have $100 million, but I had more flexibility than any previous dean had had. So I could direct a certain amount of that money towards the medical school building and actually get it done. When I took over as dean in July of 2008, the stock market was way up. In October, it crashed. So we were going to build the medical school building on loans. And the corporation, after that crash, said no loans, basically. You're not going to borrow anything. So we had to use Alpert money plus money that we raised in order to build the building. We also couldn't do what we originally planned, which is to build a new medical school building, brand new, which would have cost about $100 million. We were going to do that by going into debt. The corporation said no, so we had to look for another alternative. Somebody suggested a building that had been bought by Brown a number of years before. It was used as an office building. It was the old Breyer manufacturing plant from Breyer Manufacturing, which produced costume jewelry. Very successful. Second biggest factory in Providence, I've been told. It had gone out of business in the 70s, bought by Brown, converted into office buildings. We decided to make that the medical school building. And over about a year, we tore everything out of the insides, had a great architect, came up with a new design, and built a new medical school building. I was in charge of that, so I sort of liked that. We had a first meeting with all the facilities people, and I was appointed to be in charge of this, to have control over it and be responsible for it. The first meeting, I said, I put my cell phone down on the table, and I said, here's my cell phone number. If there are any issues, I want to be called about it. And I took real personal responsibility about getting this thing done, and we did. So I would yell at people occasionally. We had to make decisions every day about how the building was going to look, what the costs were, what the schedule was. We had a tight schedule because we had students coming in August, and the construction people didn't quite get that. And so we had to push them very hard. But it turned out to be a very successful building, and it has some interesting firsts. It's the first big building off the campus which was used for education for Brown. So there have been some other research buildings, but this was really a huge one in terms of medicine. I should modify that a little bit. Public health had been a building that had been bought and used for public health, but this was the first one in downtown Providence, across the river, to be in a part of the city called the Jewelry District, which was sort of the first of Brown really committing to being off the campus. So a big deal. It was also closer to the hospitals, much closer than what had been the campus, and the campus had been the site of the medical school before. So this was the first big jump off the campus. And it also was a huge plus for the economy of Providence at that point. Lots and lots of jobs, continuing financial support from Brown going into this, and having 400 students down in downtown Providence made a big deal. Students would move there, they would buy things there, and so, again, a big switch for Brown. So also a huge plus for our clinical faculty, particularly from Rhode Island Hospital, who could get to the medical school very easily. And that was a real shift, because before they'd try to come up to the campus, they couldn't get parking. So it was a major plus in terms of that. And then it gave me an office which was the size of a huge swimming pool. So didn't need it, but for future deans, that'll be nice. But it had all of the equipment and all of the most modern things for medical student education, which was a big change. We simply had very poor conditions before that. We probably are going to be at risk for our accreditation if we hadn't built that building. So we had, Snicky, shut up! Snicky, quiet! You're interfering with the interview. She behaves very well. So that building has really been important for education. It's allowed us to expand the class, a big deal. We couldn't do that before. It gave us new anatomy suite. We still believe in dissection, having cadavers as part of the teaching of anatomy. It's a great course. Couldn't do that effectively before, and here we could do it. Noisy. So the medical school building is very important for that aspect as well. But also, almost more important was sort of the image for medical students and faculty. All of a sudden, they had a medical school. They're getting some respect from Brown, which, it always had respect, but not in the same way. So it was like Brown really committing to this. And it was the Alpert funds that allowed us to do that. So the Alpert funds are a huge plus. By the way, the Alpert funds were interesting. They had committed to giving us money at a set schedule through about 10 years or so. So we didn't get it all up front, but we get certain payments. Every year we'd get some payments, $1 million or $2 million. Then all of a sudden we get $30 million. And they would deliver it by check to my office. So my secretary called up and said, I got this check for $30 million on my desk. What do I do with it? They were absolutely religious about giving it. It was hard cash. And it was actually a transformative gift. It's been a huge plus. One of the biggest gifts that Brown has ever gotten, by the way. So, yeah.
Well, the building was a huge accomplishment.
You're right.
Do you want to say more about, there had a discussion about the placement of the building, and you talked about that some of the reasons for not building a new building but rehabbing, but there had been lots of discussion about where it should be placed.
Right. So, by the way, that having to go to an alternative solution was dictated by finances. We didn't really have a choice. It turned out to be a much better solution. It's a bigger footprint. The building is absolutely fabulous. So if you go up on the roof, there's a terrace you can look over the whole city and back up to Brown. It's a wonderful place to meet. Students love it. And then all of the floors are just absolutely spectacular. So we didn't have a choice about that. The location had been something that had been debated a lot before I became the dean. And Ruth Simmons was at the forefront of this. Once she realized she could build a building with the Albert gift, which came in just before I had become dean, she wanted to, the initial thoughts were to have it next to the Rhode Island Hospital. Most medical schools do that. They put their medical school next to the hospital. There were some negotiations with the Rhode Island Hospital, and so Brown wanted Rhode Island Hospital to give to Brown a portion of land to build a new medical school building. The hospital responded and said, we're not going to give it to you, but we'll lease it to you for a nominal amount for 100 years. You put up the building. By the way, the hospital said, we want to be able to design, to have say-so over the design of the building, and we'll put some parking that we'll charge people for. But that was their response. Brown got very upset by this and stopped talking to the hospital about that solution.
What element was upsetting?
That was all before I became the dean, by the way.
Was there a particular element of that that was upsetting?
You'd have to talk to Ruth Simmons because she was extremely upset by that. I think there was also a request for money from Brown on a regular basis, the way most hospitals pay back to medical schools, and that was not agreed to by the hospital. So I don't know the details of that, but I do know that the relations between the hospital and Brown were at one of its lowest points ever. Brown was not talking to the hospital was not talking to Brown, and so that was actually one of the reasons I was probably brought in as dean, because I was coming out of the hospital system. He had very good relationships with the leadership of the hospital, and that was my second goal, to improve those relations. By the way, Marie Lang Lloyd was very supportive of my deanship, but also knew that issue. She was part of one of the hospitals. She was a part of the Miriam Hospital trustees. She knew the hospitals. She knew that was a priority for Brown. So that was my second priority, and over 5 years I worked very hard to improve the relations with the hospitals and finished by signing agreements with the hospitals to do several things. One of them, maybe the most important, was to have regular communications between the dean and his leadership group in the hospital and their leadership group. So I started working with George Vecchione. We met every month. George and Tim Babineau and Ken Arnold, their lawyer, we met every single month and hashed out issues that had not been done before. The same with Care New England, did the same with that group when they came on board and had regular meetings. So it was, I thought, a critical point. The second thing with the Rhode Island Hospital was we signed an agreement that would name them as the primary teaching hospital in the Brown system. And that was just the truth. That's what I talked about before, that we had to acknowledge that in part of our relationship with the hospital. And so that was part of the agreement. The third part of the agreement was they agreed to pay money every single year back to the hospital. So it was the
Back to the medical school.
I'm sorry, to the medical school. The first time George said that people said that anybody got money out of George. He was very fiscally responsible. And so, but money was delivered every single year after that for the medical school, for medical student teaching. Very similar agreement was signed with Care New England, not as the primary teaching hospital, but it's a major teaching hospital system that included women and infants and Butler Hospital and Memorial Hospital. And so a similar type of agreement. So that was the second priority and things I worked at very hard over my time as dean. And those agreements were signed and put into place for both institutions. The third priority was to develop a practice plan. That got started, but it certainly wasn't accomplished by the time I stepped down as dean. But there was an ongoing process, particularly at the Rhode Island Hospital, with the chairs of the independent departments, that is, departments that had their own practice plan at the Rhode Island Hospital. And they're the major departments. It's medicine and surgery, neurology, orthopedic surgery, emergency medicine, radiology, maybe leaving something out, but the major departments at that hospital with their faculties each had their own practice plan. And we started the process to form them into a single practice plan. That was something I did at Pittsburgh as well, but this was much more complicated and we only made a start. That's still an ongoing process, but that is the third priority. We're so far behind other medical schools in terms of having an organized practice plan with our major departments that we stand alone. So it's a very, very important thing to get accomplished. And Jack Elias will be working on that.
Any other major, I know that you were known for your two or three major goals which you were working to accomplish.
Right.
Any other goals that you added to those as you went along? You were in, and just for the record, if you could say kind of when you started being dean and when you stepped down from being dean.
Right, so I started in 1998 and I stepped down a year ago, which would be 2013, July of 2013. So those are the three major goals. Another goal turned out to occur during my deanship, which was the School of Public Health. So that had come to fruition. I actually was not in favor of it initially when I became the dean. Not unusual for deans to not want to split out part of their part of medicine and biological sciences, but that did occur, and towards the middle of my deanship, I thought that was a good idea. The provost and I disagreed about how to do it, whether to make it whether to separate out School of Public Health and make it still part of medicine and biology overall, or to split it out in a totally independent school, totally separated from medicine and biology. My concerns were about splitting it totally out were financial and the relationship between public health and medicine. Where that's happened in other schools, there's been intense rivalry, a loss of collaboration, and then a loss of really academic productivity in my mind. The provost disagreed with me. He worked hard at that decision. He and I never agreed on this issue. We actually passed white papers back and forth. So that was a disagreement we had. But in the whole process, during my 5 years as dean and other deans, we had supported public health enormously. During my deanship, the number of recruits in public health went way, way up. And Fox Weddle did a very good job. She recruited, even did some cluster recruits, one from Tufts with an evidence-based medicine group, which has been very important. So there have been great recruits into public health. We supported that school financially and administratively. And so when the split occurred right at the end of my deanship, there's a new School of Public Health, not quite approved yet, but it will be, and then the remainder of medicine and biological sciences. As I said, I was concerned about the finances, the collaboration, but also a fragile medical school taking away a portion of its research, and also in an era when medicine and public health are coming closer together in terms of goals, in terms of research. I thought that was also the wrong decision. However, this will work. I think Brown will support both institutions, and both will continue to thrive. So that was a fourth accomplishment of my deanship, although I don't particularly take primary responsibility for it. That had been something that had been going on for years and years. But I could. Actually, I will. I'll take responsibility. I was the dean where the School of Public Health was developed.
Historical record.
Yeah, right.
Any challenges that you faced? You talked a little bit about the School of Public Health. Other challenges that were memorable from your period as dean? 5 years is a long time for a dean.
Yeah, I think my main challenge, I always felt this, was the education of Brown in terms of the importance of the medical school. So Brown has always been ambivalent about its medical school. I mean, from the beginning, it was controversial. There's no question about that. Even as late as, I think, 1990, there were even calls for the dissolution of the medical school. So Brown is unlike other Ivy League universities, which have had a long history of a medical school and a long history of professional schools. Brown hasn't. The medical school, started in the 1970s, was the first professional school. And it just wasn't in the culture. The culture has been more undergraduate oriented. So every dean and I particularly felt this, had to educate Brown on the importance of the medical school, and particularly with Ruth's mandate to become a research university, and that was her mandate from the beginning of her presidency. You need a medical school. That's where the research is. It's called the National Institutes of Health. That's where our primary research funding is in this country, certainly for the biological sciences. And so I pushed that very hard. Now, all you had to do was look at the research dollars, which were in the School of Medicine, and particularly in the clinical departments. It dwarfs the funding in any other department at Brown. And it's true of every institution. If you want to be a research institution, an important part of that is a medical school. So it may not be particularly true of Princeton, but it's true every place else. And so I had to really try hard to educate the corporation, the administration, and even the faculty about the importance of the medical school and Brown's Medical School and how good it is and how important the clinical faculty are. So that was one of the big challenges, and I kept pushing very, very hard on that. I also pushed very hard on the hospitals to recognize that without Brown, without the medical school, they would just be community hospitals, and nobody would have ever heard of them, and they wouldn't be able to recruit their faculty or their chairman. So that was a blunt fact that I kept pushing in their faces, and they didn't really want to hear that, actually. They didn't want to hear that the only reason they could get a Bill Chaffee to head surgery or Mike Ehrlich to head orthopedic surgery is because there's a medical school here, and they couldn't have done it otherwise. So so there's a very, very important symbiotic relationship between Brown and the hospitals and the medical school, and that was one of my major educational efforts. I kept bleeding that story over and over and over again. And deans have to do that. It's very important. So that's a challenge, but also, I guess, an opportunity. Yeah. It's a stressful job, by the way. So I was under, I felt the responsibilities very intensely. I wanted to make everything work. And so I was under pressure. Ruth Simmons was a tough president to work for. She was very demanding. She had her own personal style. She was somebody who I admired for her major thrust, which was to make Brown a research institution. And it was a tough haul. She did that during her whole term. It was like moving an ocean liner, and she did change the direction to some extent. So I have tremendous admiration for that. But she wasn't the easiest person to work for. She was, a tough boss, but she had her priorities straight on. And the provost was another person who had a very strong personality. He was a biologist. He's an MD, but he's really a basic biologist who came in with an agenda from Berkeley, and he wanted to change things. He was somebody who was a micromanager to some extent. He really wanted to get into the details. He told me that. He said, I feel personal responsibility. If something isn't working, I got to go in and fix it. And so he wasn't always the easiest boss, but he and I agreed on most things. We worked very closely together. We joke, we'd be in meetings together 2 or 3 times a day at least. So they were, you're always, working with your bosses, but that's some stress, and then you have other stresses. We had one big accomplishment I didn't mention. We had an LCME review, which is a accreditation for the medical school. And Phil Grapuso did an outstanding job of putting it all together. We worked very hard on it. The new medical school building was a big part of why we did well, and we did extremely well. We had no issues for the LCME. They had no, whatever they're called, penalties or restrictions, citations, yeah. So that was quite unusual for a medical school to sail through like that. So that was a big accomplishment of both the team and the clinical faculty, and then I'll take a little credit for that.
Oh, you also began the process that will come to fruition this year with the primary care population.
Yes, yeah. Again, I would root on Phil Grapuso. This was really his idea, which is to have a primary care / public health track within the medical school. It's a new idea. We actually got funding for that. You've been an important part of the leadership of that. And that's something which is just coming to fruition, as you said. So a unique idea, but something right in line with Brown's strength in public health and the clinical departments, and family medicine, your department. So it's, yeah, it was a real accomplishment. But again, I was cheering on people like Phil Capuzzo and you who really made that happen. Yeah, no, but I'll take a little credit for that.
And say a little bit about, you said about the work environment, but the stresses, the hours of the job, the unique elements of the job.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the elements of the job is that deans have to speak. I spoke continuously. I speak 3 or 4 times a week at least, either introducing things, giving a more extended talk, always about the same things. You're talking about the medical school, the importance, the goals of the medical school, and so I was on the speaking circuit a lot. It just seems like I was giving talks all the time. So that's part of it, a very important part of it. Your public stance and your public persona are an important part of being the dean. And so I enjoyed that. I mean, I got a kick out of that. Occasionally got in trouble with it, you know, when I'd say something that wasn't quite what people wanted to hear, but I enjoyed that part of it. But a very important part of it. Another part is just the public relationships. You have to be out there shaking hands and glad-handing people all the time. So the hours are long. Lots and lots of evenings are taken up by this, or weekends. And so it's an intense job. And you're under a lot of pressure. You know, another thing you're responsible for is the budget of biology and medicine. So that's a huge issue. Where do you spend? How do you make sure you're balancing your budget? You know, where's the money coming from? How do you get more money? How do you support your programs? Very, very important. My relief was going and seeing my AIDS patients every Thursday afternoon. So I take care of patients who are doing well in general, but it's a whole nother experience, which just kept me in touch with clinical medicine, which is great. Really enjoy it. I missed parts of clinical medicine. I couldn't take morning report as I did as chair. And so I sort of lost touch with internal medicine to some extent during my years as dean, which I had a problem with. I really, really like medicine. I was able to get back into that during my year sabbatical after I stepped down this past year by editing a textbook on internal medicine. So it's been a great time. It's Cecil's Essentials. So it is the essentials of internal medicine. So I can sort of get back into that with that. Yeah, so very stressful job, but then stepping down after 22 years in administration is also very stressful. I don't know how the other deans found that, but I found, that you had to dial your own phone occasionally, you had to look things up yourself, you didn't have a group to do things. It's sort of a disjoint, you say, oh, you go to work today, but it's not quite the same. Smaller office, it's a great office. And then back into the department. So it's like going back in time. All of a sudden, I'm a faculty member who's going to have clinical responsibilities, doing some interesting work. I've gotten interested in the topic of aging and HIV. It's very interesting. All of our AIDS patients, most of them are on effective drugs and they're getting older. It's a geriatrics population to some extent. It's a big shift. And they also seem to have accelerated aging. They seem to get older, maybe 10 years older than a comparative non-HIV infected group. So it's a very hot area. It's a fascinating area of both biology and clinical medicine, the aging of the HIV population. So I'm going back in time in a sense, dealing with specific issues I have time to read, but life is a little less exciting. Fewer challenges.
Well, and if I remember, you had initially been asked to be the interim dean for 3 years, and at some point you became the dean, and you actually stepped down at a point earlier than your term.
Right.
I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
So I was never the interim dean. I was always the permanent dean, but given a 3-year contract. I think Ruth may have, to satisfy some people, she might have termed it as an interim to some people, but there's nothing in my letters that have said anything like that. I was renewed after 3 years for another 3-year term. Ruth knew she was going to step down during that time. After another 2 years, new provost, new president, I decided that it was time to step down. It was 5 years, a long time. I had accomplished a lot. I was 68 and had a lot of other things I wanted to do. and also realized that for the practice plan, my third priority, it would take a long-term effort. It wasn't going to happen right away. So I thought it would be an advantage to have a new dean who's going to be in for the next 5 or 10 years to do that. But the real reason I was done. After 22 years of administration, I was done. That's it. Wow. And I told people at the end when my going away speech was short, but I said, if you go down to Narragansett Bay and you see a guy out there sailing on a little Herreshoff 12.5, my sailboat, waving to you, that'll be me. Just go on into the sunset.
Well, I have kind of two final questions. One is any stories that you might want to tell from your period as dean. You had also mentioned before about a medical student that you saved their life, and your future plans.
Right. So my first future plans first is just what I told you. I'll be doing more clinical work, more teaching, and I am integrated into the infectious disease group. Now I'm reporting to a bunch of people who used to report to me. It's a little different experience. So be nice to people on your way up, because on your way down you're going to see them all again. So I'll be doing more clinical work and, as I said, more scholarly work as a faculty member. I don't intend to take sort of the role that other deans have, which is to become sort of a public spokesperson about policy. Ali Adashi's done that very effectively. Try to be a national spokesperson. I just don't think my expertise is in those areas. I could, but I just, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go back to the faculty and be a faculty member again, which I really enjoyed. So it's like going back in time a little bit. I'll travel more. One of the things I didn't mention that I was able to do, is particularly as a chair of medicine, but also as a dean, is to support global health programs. So I've been setting up programs over the last really 15 years or so in countries like Kenya. So we have a big, very active program there that I was able to support from the get-go. We have a new program in Dominican Republic. It's not so new now, which I was able to support directly as chair of medicine. A program in Haiti, which has been set up more recently, a program in India and Ghana, and then others. So as chair of medicine, I set these programs up directly with resources that I had. As dean, I set up an initiative in global health and put Susan Kiyuban, one of the infectious disease faculty members, in charge, which is really sort of the server, if you will, for global health at Brown. So programs go through there, they're supported, there's a budget. She keeps track of students, she keeps track of opportunities, she puts on symposia. So it's really one of my interests, and one of the things that I was able to do as both chair and dean. And then I love to travel overseas. I like to go overseas to see patients, take care of patients in the wards at Kenya, Dominican Republic, and just get a kick out of that kind of medicine, which is sort of resource-poor medicine. I know you've had a program in Central America. It's been very important. So those programs are a personal interest of mine that I've been able to support. So I'll do more of that as well. I have time now to take piano lessons. So I took piano as a kid for a couple of years, but now I finally have a little bit of time to do it. So I've gone back. I take lessons from a Russian piano teacher, very strict. Never gives out a compliment, but I really like it. So I've been doing that on my sabbatical, and I'll continue that. And then I'm a sailor. Enjoy that. Enjoy bike riding, gardening, my dog, my barking dog. So I like all of those things. So it frees up my time is really the point a little bit, which has been very enjoyable.
Great. And any stories, including you had mentioned before to the medical student that you had saved?
Yeah, so this is, yes, it's a little exaggerated story. So the story is I was in my clinic, I came back to the medical school building and was told by a student that another student was in trouble on the second floor, turned out in the bathroom. This turned out to be a first-year medical student who was during his first week in the medical school. He had had a known severe allergy to chickpeas and had always stayed away from them, warned everybody not to give him anything with chickpeas. Naturally, he was given something or he ate something which he didn't know had chickpeas, some hummus, chickpeas basically. He had some hummus that was the medical school, and he started having an allergic reaction. And I went up to see him, and he was in trouble. So he was starting to have trouble breathing. He was red. He was wheezing. You could hear his wheezing. He was sitting on the floor, and he had an EpiPen. He had the EpiPen. So my role was to give him the EpiPen. So I gave him epinephrine into his muscle, and he got better right away. And we took him with another medical student over to the Rhode Island emergency room. And it's interesting what happened just medically. Can we just cut this short for 1 second? Can you stop what we're doing?
Oh,
or do you want me to just continue?
Yeah, that's fine. Wait a second.
It's not going to calm down as long as that bell rang. Sneaky, come here. Come here, pup. Come here, come here, come here. This is a good dog. Come here. Come here. I know you're guarding the house. It's okay, Sneaky. Go ahead. So in any case, I gave him the EpiPen, took him over to the Rhode Island hospital with another student. They hooked him up with IVs. It was just routine for them. They gave him Benadryl, they gave him steroids, and then he crashed again. So once the epinephrine wore off, this kid was in trouble. His blood pressure went way down. He became unconscious, and they just gave him some more epinephrine, and he woke right up. He was fine by the next morning. But he had a life-threatening allergic reaction. So I didn't do much. I was credited with this, but I didn't do that much. I just happened to give him the EpiPen.
Okay, well,
that's the story of the medical student.
Anything that you'd like to add that I didn't ask? Or
No, but I would put a very positive spin on the deanship. It's a terrific opportunity to do a lot, to influence an institution, to make great friends, but to really have the authority and the responsibility to make changes for the good. And that's the big plus about administration. You can really make a difference. So you have to be that type of personality. Most doctors don't want to do that, but it turned out I did. My father-in-law was actually correct way back when to say, why don't you go into administration? And so, yeah, it's been a good 22 years, good 5 years. So it's all, not all, most of it's positive, right?
Well, so I want to thank Dean Edward Wing. It is July 22nd, 2014. We're in his house at 25 Cook Street. He's described an illustrious career, including 5 years as dean. And I really appreciate this. And I think that future generations will appreciate it as well.
Good.
Thank you so much for your insights and your stories and your wisdom.
Good. You know, so just one other thing that I don't know if you can ever splice it in, but you know, I spent 5 years as the dean. I think people should step down at a certain point. I actually stepped out at sort of the top. That's sort of a good point. I wasn't being kicked out. They weren't sending the posse after me or something. And that's an important thing for people to do in their careers. They should decide, you know, not to wait to the end, and I've seen that a lot, but to wait to an appropriate point to step down. So, good.
Thank you, gentlemen.